What if I told you that ancient Sumerian gods were actually critiquing failures, not celebrating divine perfection, but documenting rejection after rejection after rejection? This isn't the story of creation as you learned it in school. This is the story of what happens when godlike beings try to build a workforce and everything goes catastrophically wrong. In 1947, a Sumerian tablet surfaced that describes something historians have been quietly struggling to explain for decades. It wasn't about the triumph of humanity. It was about the systematic rejection of 6 different experimental body designs. The clay cylinders that didn't work, the beings that couldn't think straight, the creatures whose bodies fell apart. And here's what we've all missed. The Sumerians weren't just telling a story about the past. They were documenting a corporate process, a manufacturing failure report from the ancient world. But the angle everyone skips is this. What was the Sumerian scribe actually trying to say when they documented these failures? Were they preserving knowledge about biological engineering that somehow existed in the ancient world? Or were they encoding something else entirely? A warning, a philosophy, a metaphor for why human limitation exists? Let me back up. Most popular interpretations of this tablet focus on what was wrong with each body. The first one couldn't speak properly. The second one had vision problems. The third suffered from something the tablets describe as a kind of cognitive breaking. The mind simply fractured, and so on. The narrative everyone tells you is, see, humans were originally imperfect creations, and the gods kept trying until they got us right. But that's backwards. That's a completion narrative. That's the story we tell ourselves when we want to believe in progress and intended design. What if the real message was darker? What if these 6 rejected bodies represent something the scribes observed in their own time? The persistent, unfixable gap between what we intended to create and what we actually ended up with. The gulf between our designs and our reality? Think about this differently. The Sumerians had one of the world's first bureaucratic systems. They kept meticulous records. They tracked inventory, managed labor, documented failures. They understood quality control. So when they wrote down this tablet, they weren't just passing along mythology. They were applying the same methodology to the divine that they applied to everything else, documenting what worked, what didn't, and why. The first rejected body, let's call it Prototype 1, was described as having a mouth that couldn't articulate sound properly. The Sumerians would have understood this as a manufacturing defect, a failed specification. Like ordering 10 clay pots and having 3 of them come out with structural flaws. Reject them, document it, move to the next design. But here's where modern interpretation completely misses the psychological layer. By writing this down, the Sumerians were cementing a belief about human existence that still shapes how we think today. They were saying, imperfection is baked in. It's not accidental. It's original. Your limitation isn't a failure of the current system. It's an inheritance from the rejected designs that came before you. You are Prototype 7, and like all the others, you have flaws that were never meant to be fixed. This is the buried meaning. This isn't just ancient science fiction. This is ancient psychology. This is the Sumerians building a narrative framework for why humans will always fall short of perfection, and then passing that belief down through millennia. Because here's what historians don't talk about. The moment you accept that you're a rejected design, you stop trying to transcend your limitations. You stop seeing your flaws as errors to correct and start seeing them as features to accept. The Sumerians codified this in clay. And every religion, every philosophy, every self-help book written since has been echoing the same core belief. You are as good as you're going to get. Deal with it. But the really unsettling part? There's actual evidence that the Sumerians might have been describing something more literal than we've been comfortable acknowledging. Some scholars, carefully, quietly, in footnotes nobody reads, have suggested that the description of these rejected bodies contains details too specific to be purely metaphorical. References to biological structures, mentions of processes that sound uncomfortably like genetic selection or biological modification. I'm not saying ancient Sumerians had genetic engineering labs in the basement of the ziggurat. I'm saying they might have been describing a process they observed, whether through metaphor or genuine knowledge, that involved attempting to design a functional human body from component parts, and failing multiple times. The tablet describes it in the terminology they had available. Speech fails, vision fails, the mind breaks. In modern terms, we might describe those same failures as vocal cord dysfunction, neurological degenerative disease, and schizophrenia or cognitive fragmentation. These are real problems that affect real humans. The Sumerians documented them. They normalized them as part of our original design specification. And then the kicker, and this is what makes the story really worth your attention, the tablet doesn't end with acceptance. It doesn't end with the gods saying, well, we gave it a shot, let's just work with what we've got. It ends with a choice, a deliberate decision to stop trying, to accept the seventh iteration, us, with full knowledge of what we're missing, full acknowledgement that better designs existed in their planning stages and were rejected. That's not failure, that's intent. That's a conscious choice to populate the world with limited beings, fully aware of the limitation. The question becomes, why would anyone, God, ancient engineer, or civilization, deliberately choose the flawed version? Why reject 5 working prototypes and install the broken one? That's the angle the academic papers dance around. That's the question that keeps appearing in the margins and footnotes and quietly posed conference questions that never make it into the official transcripts. Because if you answer that question, you're not just explaining an ancient myth. You're suggesting something deeply uncomfortable about human purpose itself. Maybe the 7 rejected bodies weren't failures at all. Maybe they were too perfect. Maybe they worked too well. Maybe a species that could see perfectly wouldn't need hope. A mind that never fractured would never need to rebuild itself. A body that functioned flawlessly would never understand suffering and therefore never understand compassion. The Sumerians might have been documenting something far deeper than a manufacturing process. They might have been describing the necessary rejection of perfection in favor of something that required growth. If you want to dive deeper into what the actual Sumerian text says, the specific passages, the exact terminology used, the scholarly debates that have raged for decades, there's a detailed breakdown in the description below and in the pinned comment that walks through the original translations word by word. The evidence is fascinating because once you understand what the tablet actually claimed about each rejected design, the whole story shifts. It stops being about divine failure and starts being about divine choice. And that changes everything about how you understand your own place in this narrative. So here's where this gets really interesting. Because the Sumerians weren't the only ancient civilization documenting versions of this story. The patterns repeat. The rejected bodies appear in different forms across Mesopotamian texts, in Hindu creation myths, in Gnostic interpretations of Genesis. Different names, different cultural contexts, but the same core narrative. The gods tried multiple times to make humans, and each time, something went wrong. The consistency is almost eerie, too consistent to be coincidental, too consistent to be independent invention across separated cultures. Unless, of course, they weren't independent at all. Unless they were all describing something that actually happened, something that was witnessed or experienced across multiple regions and documented in the mythological language available to those cultures. The rejected bodies weren't theology, they were history encoded in the only format ancient scribes had, sacred narrative. And that's the real mystery that nobody wants to seriously investigate, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the implications are uncomfortable. Because if ancient Sumerians were documenting actual events, actual attempts at creating functional humans, actual experiences of failure, then we have to ask, who was doing the creating? What knowledge did they possess? Where did they go? And why did they leave us with this particular story? The tablet stops there. The narrative concludes with our acceptance as the seventh iteration, and then the story moves forward into the known historical record. We don't see another update. We don't see the creators return with a note explaining themselves. We don't get the epilogue where they tell us what happens next or what they expected us to do with this information. All we have is the document. All we have is the assertion that 5 better versions were rejected and we were chosen. With full knowledge of what we're lacking, with full knowledge of our limitations written into the specification. Now, most people who learn about this tablet stop at the surface level. They see it as a curiosity, an interesting ancient story that illuminates how humans thought about their origins, a piece of historical trivia. But I'd argue you're missing the real significance. The real significance isn't what the tablet says about the past. The real significance is what it's been doing to us in the present. For thousands of years, humans have internalized this narrative. You are a rejected design. You are prototype 7. Your limitations are original. Your flaws are features. This is as good as it gets. And somewhere along the way, that belief became so embedded in our culture that we stopped questioning it. We started building entire systems, education, psychology, medicine, even religion, around the acceptance of human limitation as inevitable and unchangeable. What if the Sumerians were documenting something that was never meant to be accepted? What if the tablet was a warning, not a prophecy? What if they were writing down, this happened before? This is what happened when beings were designed with the assumption of permanent limitation. Don't let this happen to you. But the message got lost in translation, or maybe it got deliberately obscured, because accepting your limitations is a lot easier for those in power than having a population that believes in radical transcendence. The Sumerian tablet describes 6 failures, 6 instances of the design process going wrong. But what they're really describing, if you read between the carved lines, is 6 different ways that humans have attempted to exceed their programming, 6 different paths to transcendence that were rejected before they ever happened, and 6 different reminders that someone somewhere decided you were better off limited. The question isn't why the rejections occurred. The question is, why were we designed in the first place, knowing we'd be imperfect? Why accept us with our flaws? What was the purpose of creating a species that would always fall short? The answer to that might change everything you think you know about human purpose, human potential, and what we're actually capable of becoming if we stop accepting the narrative that Sumer handed down to us. If we stop seeing our limitations as original design and start seeing them as temporary constraints waiting to be shattered. That's the story nobody tells about the Sumerian tablet. That's the story the scribes were afraid to write directly, so they encoded it in clay and left it for us to discover. And now that you've read it, now that you understand what's really being said in those carved symbols, you have a choice. You can accept the narrative. You can believe that you're prototype 7, flawed and limited and exactly as designed to be. You can settle into your constraints and find peace and acceptance. There's dignity in that choice. There's wisdom there. Or you can reject the rejection. You can look at those 6 failed designs and ask, what were they trying to achieve that was too dangerous to allow? What heights could they reach that made them unacceptable? And then you can decide, am I going to stay in my designated limitation, or am I going to find out what's actually possible when a rejected prototype decides it doesn't have to be rejected anymore? That's where the real story begins. Because here's what historians have been quietly noticing for decades. The Sumerian texts don't just describe failure, they describe progression. Each rejected design isn't random, they're building towards something. It's like watching someone in a workshop refine an idea, discarding versions that don't quite work, getting closer with each attempt. The first body failed because it was too passive. It couldn't initiate. It waited to be told what to do. That's not a flaw in Sumerian thinking. That's a design specification they were testing. A being that couldn't act on its own impulses couldn't rebel. The second body failed because it saw too much. Its sensory perception was overwhelming. It couldn't filter reality into manageable pieces. And that matters because an unfiltered mind is a questioning mind. It notices contradictions. It asks why the boundaries exist in the first place. The third body failed because it didn't forget. It had perfect memory. Every command, every constraint, every contradiction, all of it stayed pristine in its consciousness. Forgetting is actually a feature, not a bug. Forgetting lets you move forward. Perfect memory makes you a living archive of every injustice. Do you see what's happening here? The Sumerians weren't describing technological failure. They were describing a security problem. Every rejected prototype was rejected because it had the capacity for something that couldn't be allowed: independent thought, unfiltered perception, accumulated grievance, or the ability to ask uncomfortable questions. And this is where we need to be honest about something most academic papers dance around. The seventh design, the one that survived, is you. Humans as we actually exist. We are the prototype that was finally deemed acceptable, and understanding why requires asking what they changed. We have reduced sensory perception compared to many animals. We forget easily, so easily that it frustrates us. We have natural impulses toward obedience and hierarchy. We experience awe and transcendence when we contemplate forces larger than ourselves. We are capable of convincing ourselves that our constraints are actually our highest expression. These aren't random traits, these are specifications. But, and this is crucial, we also have something the rejected prototypes didn't have, or had in carefully limited doses: creativity. We have the ability to reframe our limitations as features, to find meaning within our boundaries, to make art and music and stories that turn constraint into beauty, to look at our own design and say, this is broken, and then decide to break it further on purpose, in directions they never anticipated. The Sumerians created a narrative where the rejected prototypes are failures, and the seventh is success. But what if success was just surrender? What if the reason those other designs were rejected wasn't because they failed, but because they threatened? A being that questioned too much, a being that saw too clearly, a being that remembered everything and never let injustice fade, a being that wouldn't obey without understanding why. These weren't bugs, they were features that made control impossible. And we've spent most of human history trying to suppress those features in ourselves. We've created religions and philosophies and political systems specifically designed to help us accept our constraints. We've called it wisdom. We've called it maturity. We've called it responsibility. Some of it genuinely is those things. Civilization requires some level of shared constraint. You can't have a functioning society where everyone acts on every impulse immediately. There's actual value in hierarchy and routine and the ability to delay gratification. But there's also been something else happening underneath, a centuries-long effort to perfect the seventh design, to remove the anomalies, to breed out the questioning, to reward forgetting, to make us grateful for boundaries we never agreed to, until something strange started happening in the last few centuries. The more we learned, the less the narrative held together. We started finding the gaps in the story. We realized that the gods who rejected the earlier designs were actually people, people with agendas, people who benefited from having a population that didn't question too much, didn't see too clearly, didn't remember too well. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Which is why the really interesting question isn't about ancient Sumer at all. It's about you, right now. You've been told a story about what you are. You've been told you're the seventh design, the successful one, the right one, the final version. You've been shown the 6 rejected prototypes and invited to feel grateful that you don't have their flaws. But what if you're carrying rejected features too? What if somewhere in your genetics, in your neurology, in your capacity for imagination, there's something that makes the controllers uncomfortable? What if the reason you sometimes feel like you don't fit is because part of you is designed to exceed the boundaries they've drawn? The Sumerians told their story in clay. We're living ours in code and neurobiology and culture, but the essential question is the same. Are you going to accept the narrative that you're a finished product, a successfully designed being with no further potential for evolution? Or are you going to recognize that the limitations you feel might not be flaws to overcome individually, but patterns installed to prevent you from reaching your actual capacity? And if it's the second one, if you're starting to sense that the rejected prototypes were rejected for reasons that have nothing to do with genuine inadequacy, then what? Do you spend your life trying to become a better version of the seventh design? Or do you start asking the questions that made the first 6 unacceptable? If you want to explore this deeper, and I mean really explore it, not just consume content about it, there's a resource in the pinned comment and in the description that goes much further into the neuroscience of how we're designed to accept limitations and the specific patterns you can recognize when someone is trying to keep you within boundaries. Because here's what the Sumerians understood, even if we've forgotten it. The story doesn't end with acceptance or rejection, it ends with choice. And that choice happens not in ancient temples, but in you, in whether you're going to stay in your designated 7th design or start investigating what the first 6 had that was worth rejecting. The tablet is silent now. The decision is yours. So what do we do with this now? Because understanding an ancient Sumerian concept is interesting, but acting on it, that changes everything. First, you need to understand that the 7th design isn't evil. It's not even wrong. It's just designed for a specific purpose: stability, predictability, integration into a system. And for some people, for some seasons of life, that's exactly what they need. There's no shame in that. But here's what changes everything: knowing that you're in the 7th design. Because once you know it, you can't unknow it. You start noticing the patterns. You start seeing where the boundaries are. You start recognizing when someone, your parents, your employer, your culture, your own internalized voice, is reinforcing those limits because it's safer for them if you stay contained. The first 6 designs were rejected for a reason. Some were too bold, some were too unpredictable. Some threatened the order that others had built, and yes, some genuinely wouldn't have worked. But the point isn't that those designs were right and the 7th is wrong. The point is that you get to consider them. Think about what it would mean if you actually allowed yourself to explore those rejected designs. What would happen if you took one small element from the bold one, the one that threatened the status quo, and integrated it into your life? What if you borrowed something from the unpredictable design, just enough to make you feel alive, but not so much that you destabilize everything else? This isn't about rejecting all stability. This is about being intentional, about recognizing that you don't have to choose between the seventh design and complete chaos. You can be designed, but designed by you, for you, informed by the knowledge that other versions of yourself were possible. The Sumerians didn't leave us the tablet to say, hey, feel bad about your life. They left it to say, look, we tried other designs, they didn't fit, but you might want to know what was in them anyway. And if you want to go much deeper into what those 6 rejected designs actually represent in modern psychological terms, the archetypes they embody, how they show up in your own decision making, and what the ancient Sumerian scribes were really trying to warn us about, there's a full breakdown waiting for you in the description and in the pinned comment. It pulls together the neuroscience, the mythology, and the practical framework for recognizing which design you're currently living in. The real question isn't whether the 7th design is right for you. The real question is whether you're the one choosing it, because that's where the power is. Not in rejecting what you have, not in pursuing some impossible perfection, but in making the conscious choice to stay, or to change, or to evolve your design slowly over time, knowing that you could design yourself differently if you wanted to. The Sumerians understood something we've largely forgotten, that most of what we think is fixed about ourselves, about our potential, about what we're capable of, isn't actually fixed at all. It was designed that way, and if it was designed, it can be redesigned. You're not in the 7th design because it's the only option. You're in it because, at some point, someone decided that's where you should go. Maybe that was you, maybe it wasn't. But that decision doesn't have to be final. So here's what I want you to do this week. Notice where you're in the 7th design, not to judge it, not to feel bad about it, but just to see it clearly. Notice the patterns, the limitations, the places where you've accepted a boundary that someone else drew. And then ask yourself one question: did I choose this or did I inherit it? If you inherited it, and most of us have in some form, then you have work to do. Not dramatic work, not destructive work, just the quiet, patient work of slowly, intentionally designing yourself in a way that actually aligns with who you want to be. The Sumerian tablet is nearly 5,000 years old, and it's still teaching us the same lesson, that the versions of ourselves we reject or abandon, the ones that don't fit, the ones that frighten us, the ones that threaten the order, those versions matter. They matter because they show us what's possible. They show us what we chose not to be. And sometimes, looking back at those choices, we realize we want to reconsider. If you're serious about understanding how to recognize which design you're living in and how to intentionally evolve beyond it, check out the deeper resource in the description and the pinned comment. It's got the specific patterns, the psychological frameworks, and the exercises that actually help. It's all there waiting for you. The Sumerians made their tablets. The priests interpreted them, the people accepted them or rejected them, and then time moved forward, the world changed, and thousands of years later, we're sitting here with fragments of stone, trying to understand what they were trying to tell us. Maybe they were telling us this, that you're not as fixed as you think you are, that the 7th design is real, yes, but it's not inevitable, and that the bravest thing you can do isn't to tear your entire life apart in search of some mythical authenticity. The bravest thing is to be honest about where you are, why you're there, and whether you actually want to stay. Thank you so much for joining me on this dive into one of history's strangest and most revealing documents. The Sumerian tablet doesn't scream at us, it whispers. And sometimes the whispers are the most important lessons we'll ever hear. If this resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss when we explore these kinds of stories and ideas together. The ones that textbooks skip over, but that actually shape how we understand ourselves and our world.